Okay. All right. So, welcome to the Iowa Native Plant Society meeting. And I am your host, but I'm going to pass it off to Sarah very quickly, and then we will get to Beth's talk. So take it away, Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Iowa Native Plant Society's annual meeting. We're really excited to be able to share with you some research coming out of Luther College, thanks to Dr. Beth Lynch. The Iowa Native Plant Society is really a group of volunteer individuals all across the state that are passionate about all of Iowa's native ecosystems. Molly heads up our grant program, which we're really proud of to be able to give back for restoration efforts, floristic inventories, lots of equipment, lots of different things that folks need out on the ground to do good restoration work throughout the state. We have a newsletter that comes out twice a year. Check out our website. We offer field trips all throughout most of the growing season. And yeah, we're a good group, and we just appreciate you being active with us today. And for those of you that are members, thank you so much. And if you're not a member, we would love to have you. So yeah, go ahead, take it away.
Okay. All right. So Beth, you've shared your screen. I'm gonna sort of spotlight you now. I'm gonna turn my mic off, and if you need anything, you can either speak up or send me a chat. Sound good?
All right. Can you hear me? Good. Well, good morning. And it's so nice to be able to join this group this morning to share some of the things that I've been thinking about lately. I will say that I am by training a paleoecologist. So I'm used to thinking about plant communities in very much a long-term historical perspective. And I usually look at pollen and little pieces of charcoal in lake sediments to try and reconstruct how plant communities have changed in response to climate and other factors over long periods of time. But the longer I have spent living in Iowa and in Northeast Iowa in particular, the more interested I've become in just learning about the flora of this area. And recently I've started working more on Algific slopes. And so I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've been thinking about lately. This is not, not a data-rich talk because I don't have a lot of data yet, but I have a lot of questions and a lot of just observations that I've made by having the privilege to explore some of these sites. So I'll be touching on microclimate of Algific slopes, what I've discovered so far about that, their plant communities, and trying to think about this in the context of climate change. Oh dear. There we go. So I want to, before I do anything else, acknowledge the students who have worked with me for 2 long field seasons and during the academic year on collecting some of this data and just being very fun collaborators on the project. From left to right in the images here are Jill Richards, Annalise Meyer, and Justin Stewart. They've all graduated now, but all played very big parts in the field research that I did and analyzing some of the results. And I'll be sharing some of their data today. And then we've had some funding and logistical support from a variety of sources, and very grateful for that as well. So I think, most people in Iowa know what Algific Talus slopes are, but just very quickly, Algific means cold, and Talus refers to large chunks of bedrock that accumulate at the base of cliffs over geological time as they fracture off and fall due to gravity. And Algific talus slopes are a very rare phenomenon globally, but we have a lot of them in Iowa and in the adjacent driftless area in other states. They occur where you have both very strong seasonal temperature changes, so a severe winter and then summers, and they occur because there are large joints in the bedrock and caves where with a lot of airflow, so we can get cold air underground, we can get water underground, and in the winter that causes ice to form, And in the summer, air moving over that accumulated ice, cold, dense air comes out at the base of the slope through vents between these large blocks of bedrock, the talus, and keep the microclimate there quite cool and moist. And so you can see accumulations of mosses and ferns, and often a lack of trees because of the very rocky substrate. And because of the cool, moist conditions in these microhabitats, we have some of the rarest plant species in Iowa. Among them are northern monkshood that I show in the top right here, which is a federally threatened species. And there are many other cold adapted plant species whose main ranges are north of us here that occur on these Algific sites. And some mollusks, including the Iowa Pleistocene snail, which is a federally endangered species. And we worry about these special microhabitats because their habitat is dwindling. Not all of them are protected. Many of them are on private land. We're seeing more and more invasive plant species. And I've been thinking, as I mentioned, about climate change, and there are other threats as well. But we'll think about climate change today. I was inspired to think about Algific slopes in the context of climate change in 2020 when a special issue of this journal came out. This is published by the Ecological Society of America, looking at climate change refugia. So the authors of the papers in this issue were thinking about where on the landscape, where will we find habitat for species that are threatened by climate change? Are there places on the habitat on the landscape that will stay cooler for longer? And the term they use for this is climate refugia. And of course, many people think that Algific slopes in Iowa have served as refugia since the last glacial for northern adapted species that were living in Iowa 10,000 years ago across the landscape, and whose habitat has shrunk to these little refugia. Whether or not that's what happened is debatable. We don't have good evidence. But what I'm interested in is, in the future, will Algific slope habitats continue to buffer the climate change and be refugia for cold adapted plant species? Or will, under future climate conditions, the microclimates of Algific slopes disappear? Will they no longer be refugia for cold adapted species? And this is a familiar diagram to many of us, just showing how temperature has changed in the last 100 years. This is for Iowa, and just pointing out that the average annual temperature in Iowa is 1 degree Fahrenheit warmer today than it was 100 years ago, and we expect it to continue to warm in the future, which is why Algific slopes may be threatened, and certainly why the habitat around them may not be suitable for many plant species in Iowa. Most of the temperature increase that we have observed is during the winter months. And this is interesting to me because winter is when the ice is forming underground that's feeding the cold air vents during the summer. What will happen to ice formation as winters continue to get warmer? One of the interesting things to me about Algific slopes is they're so precious and they're so rare, but we have almost no baseline data on temperature or plant communities. There are a few measurements that have been made over time, but it's really hard to find the data. In terms of vegetation, there's really very little. And the other thing is nobody's monitoring these changes over time. And after reading the articles in 2020, I just thought, oh my goodness, well, we should do this. And so I decided that I would start measuring temperature and looking at plant communities so that we would have baseline data, so we would know whether these communities were changing in the future. So in 2021, students and I went to 2 sites, Finch Memorial Hardwoods and Turkey River. These are units of the Driftless Area National Wildlife Refuge, that's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the first year of our study, our goal was simply to characterize soil temperature and the plant communities on these two slopes. Finch Memorial is in Winneshiek County and Turkey River is down near Elkader in Clayton County. I wanted to install permanent transects, so whatever measurements we made in 2021 could be repeated in the future, whether that be 5 years, 10 years, 20 or 30 years. So we installed permanent 30-meter transects on both the Algific slope and in the adjacent forest where there aren't cold vents, just as a control site, so that we could see if temperatures change more on one or the other habitat. We measured soil temperature with little just digital handheld thermometers, because that's what we had, at 1 meter intervals along those 30-meter transects 3 times during the summer, so early, mid, and late summer. And then we documented the plant species at every meter using a point intercept method. And I made a species list for each site, just recording all of the vascular plant species and bryophytes that we could identify on the entire Algific slope, not just on our transects. So this is not surprising, the results that we got in 2021. The first thing that I can say is that the Algific slope soils are colder than the forest soils. So we're measuring soil temperature at 7 centimeters depth. And this graph on the right shows a comparison of the Algific slope and the forest average temperature in midsummer at Finch and at Turkey River. We have a lot more data points from the Algific slopes because we sampled a lot more intensively there. We have 165 observations compared to only 5, for example, at Turkey River. That being said, on the Algific slope, there's a ton of variability in the temperatures across the slope. So some parts of the slope are warmer, some are a lot colder where the vents are, not surprising. And there's nothing new about the research that I'm showing here. We've known this for a long time. People have measured these kinds of things before, but now we have a baseline for 2021 on permanent transects, and somebody can refine the exact locations where we took these measurements and repeat them in the future. We don't have that anywhere else. The students made these really neat maps showing the temperature at all of the locations that they measured. So each of these squares represents a meter along one of those 30-meter long transects, and they had 5 transects on the Algific slope here. And you can see the locations of the cold vents where the temperature in June was colder, and there are some very warm parts on the Algific slope as well. So it's really heterogeneous. These habitats are not, they're just very finely structured, and they change over time. Here's June, getting warm in July, and then cooling down again in October. The results of our vegetation surveys from that first year showed that we had 84 vascular plant species. We identified 19 bryophyte taxa just growing on the soil surface or rocky surface itself, and there are probably more. We didn't spend a lot of time on the bryophytes. What's really interesting to me is that these 2 sites shared only 40% of their vascular plant species, meaning more than half of the plants that we found on each site were different from one to the other. And close to 20% of the species that we found had very high coefficient of conservatism values, meaning they're very restricted to these kinds of habitats. And these include things like northern monkshood, the federally threatened species, Iowa golden saxifrage, which we know relies on these cold, moist habitats, and balsam fir and moschatel, and lots of other neat species too. We did find non-native species, including garlic mustard, on one of the sites. Then in 2022, I was able to get grant funding to buy some very fancy temperature loggers. There's one shown in the ground on the bottom right of this slide here. These loggers measure soil temperature at 10 centimeters depth. They measure temperature at the soil interface, and then they measure temperature up here at, I think it's 10 centimeters above the soil surface. And they measure these temperatures every 15 minutes, which is excessive, but that's what they do. And so we're generating now a lot of data on these transects, soil and air temperature every 15 minutes. And I have about a dozen that we installed on these two sites, Finch, which is one of the sites from 2021, and we added Lionberger Preserve, which is owned by Luther College and also in Winneshiek County for this part of the study. Justin measured light and canopy openness as well this summer because we were interested in seeing whether the higher amount of sunlight on the Algific slope might be causing some of the really rather high soil temperatures there. And in addition, I generated a species list for the Algific slope at Lionberger. So I'm just going to show you the soil and air temperature results from that year. So now what we have plotted on this graph is on the bottom, we have date. So starting in mid-May and going to sometime in October. And this is temperature. And this is degrees Celsius now. Each of the lines is one of those fancy data loggers. And I took the average temperature for every day and plotted it across the season. The blue lines are data loggers that were on the Algific slope. So they're cooler than the green lines, which were data loggers installed in the forest. The slightly different color of blue and green reflect the two different sites. So the lighter blue and the lighter green are from Finch. The darker blue and the darker lighter, anyway, it doesn't matter. I can't even tell my colors apart, but we have forests and Algific slope, two different sites, all on one graph. First of all, there's a lot of spread in the blue lines, reflecting the enormous variability in temperatures across the Algific slopes. You'll see again that Algific slope temperature of the soil is colder than in the forest, no surprise. What we thought was very interesting is that it stays colder all the way through into fall, late summer into fall, indicating that if there is underground ice that's causing cooler temperatures through these vents, it's probably persisting through the summer, at least in 2022 it was. The other thing that we were really surprised to find is that there are these interesting spikes on the Algific slope in soil temperature. And when we plotted the temperature with rainfall data collected by the National Weather Service, we could see a really clear relationship between heavy rainfalls and those temperature spikes. So the axis on the right-hand side of this graph is showing the amount of precipitation in a single day. The scale tops out at 10 centimeters, so roughly 5 inches. This was a really big rain. And if you remember, in 2022, we did have several very big rainfall events. And so here are some of those bigger rains, and you can see the spike in soil temperature following those rains. As the rainwater percolates through, the temperature cools down again on the Algific slope, but it never in any of these reaches its former cool temperature. So we see a permanent bump in the soil temperature on the Algific slope with each of these major rainfall events. This was a really interesting finding for me because I think we all have noticed that it's become rainier in our part of the country over the past 100 years, and notice how much rainier Northeast Iowa in particular has come. And so not only do we have a greater amount of precipitation annually, those rainfall events are coming more frequently in extreme storms with 2 inches or more of rain. So this is a graph here showing number of days with precipitation of more than 2 inches. and we can see an increase over time in those major rainfall events. So I do wonder what effect that might be having on perhaps melting the ice on the Algific slopes, or in any case, warming the soils. I'm not sure what the mechanism is. The other thing that I found really fascinating, looking now at 3 sites in some detail, Finch, Turkey River, and Lionberger, so these 2 in Winneshiek County and Turkey River down in Clayton County, is how different the flora is at each one of these sites. So I already mentioned in 2021, we compared the 2 sites, Finch and Turkey River, and saw very little overlap. In 2022, I added Lionberger, which has several really cool cold adapted species that neither Finch nor Turkey River has. And I was able to find 2 published studies, one from Bixby State Preserve and one from Rogman State Preserve, where authors published species lists from the sites, and the sites include Algific slopes, and they indicated whether or not a given species occurred on the Algific slope. And I'm just going to show you some examples of species with high coefficient of conservatism values, 10, that have very different distributions. That is, they don't always occur at all sites, and some of them only occur at 1 or 2. And I don't show most people these slides because they don't understand how interesting all these little plant species are, but I think you guys will probably appreciate them. So we'll take a look. So the first is Cystopteris, or the fragile fern Cystopteris bulbifera. And this is the one that it's very clearly associated with Algific slope habitats. It grows in other habitats as well, but when you see a lot of it, you start thinking, oh, that must be there may be something going on there. And it's at all 5 of our sites. Field chickweed, Cerastium arvense, is at 4 of the 5, wasn't reported from Bixby. Northern monkshood, which has a really curious distribution here in the driftless area, and then in some colder cliffy sites in Ohio and New York, and seems to be a different subspecies from what's in the Mountain West, only at Turkey, Bixby, and Rogman. So it's missing at the sites farther north here in Winneshiek County. Dwarf enchanter's nightshade, which is, we're at the southern and range limit here for its eastern population. Only Finch, Lionberger, Bixby, and Rogby. So why is it missing from Turkey River? I have no idea. We looked hard. Dwarf scouring rush, we're also at its southern range limit here, only at Lionberger and Rogman. Rhamnus alnifolia, again, we're at its southern range limit here, only at Finch and Rogman. It's also here in Decorah at Doug Road, as are some of these other species. Iowa golden saxifrage, which lives only in Northeast Iowa and a couple of locations in Minnesota, and then has a big, very abundant in the Mountain West in Canada, only at Finch and Bixby. Mertensia paniculata, the northern lungwort, I only found at Lionberger, where it has a really nice healthy population mixed in with a nice healthy population of garlic mustard. And here's a really weird one. This is the last one. I found a handful, literally fewer than 5 individuals of Senecio at Lionberger. Didn't see it at any of the other sites. It's a species I had never seen before. I didn't know what it was. And look at its distribution. I don't know why it's here in Winneshiek County on that Algific slope. It's reported from fens in northwestern Iowa. So if anybody has ideas, I'd love to hear about that. So yeah, just very interesting patchy distributions of these rare plant species. So just to sum up, what have I learned so far by trying to dig into these algific slopes a bit. So for microclimate, we now have 3 sites where we have continuous temperature loggers on permanent transects. 2 are part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Driftless Area National Wildlife Refuge, and 1 at Lionberger. From these measurements, we know that algific slopes are really variable in soil temperature, but also significantly colder than the forest soils. And we see some indication that summer rainfall events can cause soil to warm pretty quickly on algific slopes. For the plant communities, it's clear that each species has a really distinctive plant assemblage, and many of our rarest plant species are infrequent, even when you have the right, what seems to us to be the right habitat. The implications of this are that protecting just some of these algific slopes aren't going to protect all of the rare species. We really need to be protecting as many of them as possible to protect all of these populations. And then this isn't the finding, but because of this really interesting biogeography in the plants, I plan to survey 5 additional sites in 24-25. So I plan to resurvey Rogman to see if we have changes in the flora from what were reported in 86 by Thomas Lammers, and then 4 other sites. And then I just want to make a plug, I guess, for having carefully archived baseline data of temperature and plant communities from all of our habitats in Iowa, so that we have some way to know whether and how things are changing as we go into the future. So I think with that, I will end and open it up to questions.
Thank you, Beth. That was just fantastic. And so I think hopefully we can get a chance here to ask Beth some questions. You can do this one of 2 ways. If you want to go ahead and put something in the chat, and then I can kind of just have that, I can try to filter some of those for Beth. And then the other piece is if you want to go ahead and you can raise your hand through the reactions button. And if you're having trouble with all of that, we can also just have you sort of unmute. So Beth, I think the first one, so Scott had something in the chat, and I will rephrase it just a little bit in terms of like, do you think it would be important to start temperature logging like earlier? And is that something your permanent loggers are going to be already giving you? And then do you think it's necessary, in addition to those permanent loggers, that you would go back in and sample like the students did across those transects in a kind of a more expansive manner besides the 12?
Yeah, so the first part is about extending the season for monitoring, and we now, those loggers, the new fancy loggers, are monitoring temperature every day all year long, and I just haven't had the time to replot it. You know, we now have 2 years for some of those sites through the winter as well as summer, so that'll be really interesting to see. And I hope they're supposed to last for 10 to 15 years. I'm skeptical, but we will see. So yes. And then the second question, is it necessary to do the intensive logging that we did in the first year? I don't think so. And I think it's better not to spend a lot of time walking around on these slopes. We did it because we were interested in getting a systematic survey of vegetation abundance. And we figured, well, while we're there and we have thermometers and we don't have temperature loggers yet, let's just take temperature while we're doing it. But that being said, that intensity of sampling really does show us where the vents are, how big the vents are. And if we are starting to see changes over time in the extent and duration of ice underground, it may take more intensive monitoring to really see that. So I say minimize the amount of time you're walking across these slopes, but but there is interesting information to be gained. The loggers that we have now are only measuring 12 locations on any given slope compared to 100 locations that we had in that first year.
And I'll paraphrase Connie if you feel like you want to unmute and talk more about this, but it sounds like Connie's really interested in other studies being done in Iowa and or in surrounding states. And I think I would actually ask that as another sort of two-piece question. One, specifically, it sounds like a lot of the Algific Talus slope stuff there's not extensive. And so are there any other Algific Talus slope studies going on that you know of right now? And I think maybe the other piece is who is doing the kind of work you're talking about in terms of this really getting temperature in particular habitats, getting that baseline? And do you know of that in Iowa or nearby? So that's kind of a two-part question, I think, maybe.
Okay, so first question, who else is studying temperature and plant communities on Algific slopes? I'm hoping some of you can tell me. If you do know of people, let me know. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, the DNR through the Natural Features Inventory programs has done more systematic surveys of all plant communities in their state than we have been able to do in Iowa. So there is information. They've done releves, that sort of survey on Algific slopes in Minnesota. I'm not sure about Wisconsin. In Iowa, I don't know of any published surveys other than the species list that I found from Bixby and Rogman. I'm seeing Deb's head in there. Maybe she knows. So that's the answer I have for the first part. And the second part of the question is, are we doing any continuous monitoring, collecting baseline data in other habitats in Iowa? Is that right? I don't know. I hope so. Does anybody know?
I think that's a great plug for future grad studies, Beth, to really sort of start establishing those permanent transects. Okay, so, and I'm going to, let's see here. We've got, Sarah, maybe time for 2 more questions. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, this has been a really great presentation. So I'm happy to answer a few more questions, or not me, but.
Awesome. Well, I think what sounds like Kara's got you just you fascinated Kara, and I think Kara probably speaks for the rest of us that they're small, but they're incredibly fascinating, as you have told us. So so it looks like Deb has got questions about size of the slopes. And maybe some context on whether that contributes to diversity. And I would also say maybe even remoteness, Deb, from other sites as well. So Beth, if you can kind of give us a sense on that.
I think those are really interesting questions to be asking, and ones that I don't have the data on size and proximity to other sites at this point, but it's something that I'd really like to add as I start getting data from additional sites, is trying to figure out, okay, what's driving these differences? One of the problems that I have is I don't know if there's a map of all the Algific slopes in Iowa. So I'm not sure I know how close they are to one another. I know that we've mapped some of them, but is that data available somewhere? I'd love to see it. But yeah, those are 2 factors that I think are really interesting. And I wanted to add too that in terms of the differences in the communities, I don't know if that's because we've been seeing species blink out over time. Did they all start more similar and we've been losing populations of species just because these are small isolated habitats? Or did they start out different in their composition? I think that's just a fascinating question. and one that we'll never be able to answer, but maybe going forward, we'll get to see some patterns.
Okay. And so I think I'm gonna kind of combine Matt's and Sarah's question here in terms of visiting these types of algific talus slopes. Is this a community we don't want to visit just because of the, you know, how fragile they are? Are these sites open to the public? What are the proper methods? Should we, what kind of, what's your advice surrounding that? Because these are clearly places we want to conserve. So.
Yeah, that's a great question, Molly. And there's such fascinating, interesting places. And when I first moved here, I was just, wow, I wish I could see them. And there are some that are very accessible and easy to see without damaging them. And I can recommend some in a second. I just want to add too, it took me a really long time to get up the courage to do the kind of work that I've described today, because I really didn't want to be on these slopes. It was a moral dilemma for me to say, is it worth it to go out there and gather this information, or should we just stay off of these slopes? And I finally was motivated to because of the lack of information and our lack of ability to know what's happening, to try to get some baseline data as carefully as possible. But it's a hard decision to do that. That being said, so many of the slopes that I'm visiting are closed to the public, and I think that's a good idea. But there are some that are really accessible and have some really beautiful cold air vents and nice rare species on them. One of them is Doug Road, accessible along a paved bike trail here in Decorah. You can just walk along it and see right in front of your eyes all sorts of neat plant species and cold air vents. There's another one here in Decorah at Chattahoochee Park, right along the road again. It's very, very small, but has beautiful bryophyte flora right there, and you can stick your hand there and feel how cold it is. Trying to think of others that are accessible. Perhaps other people know in other parts of the state. Yes, Bixby. Yeah, Russ Kleinman and Karen have done, Blissard have done a survey at Bixby, which is quite accessible near the road.
And I'll just put in a quick note that when Beth identified the garlic mustard on some of the sites and really kind of framed as how much it was encroaching on these areas, some of the students have been going out and pulling garlic mustard from these sites, and I joined them last year. And even walking and pulling garlic mustard where you know you're doing good, it is really like you're walking and you're very carefully just kind of thinking about like, okay, every single step I'm making, I could be sort of crunching something else. So, and that's a restricted site, but so, okay. I think with that, we can all give sort of a virtual applause to Beth for a fantastic talk. I live right next door to Beth in terms of as a colleague, and I've learned even more. So this is fantastic. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you for everybody for being here.
Okay. Yes, Beth, thank you so much.
At this point, we're going to head into an announcement. Mary Beth, you've got a camera in front of you. Why don't you just, and Connie, you don't have to switch out your computer. Mary Beth, why don't you just go ahead and you can show your images as you want to talk about them, and then we can get a sense of what your book is about. Does that sound good?
But you can't, can other people see this as a large image, or is it just a small?
I think we're good. I think if
image.
we get kind of those close-up images, Mary Beth can hold those up in front of us, as the book.
Okay.
We could
So,
spotlight her if we need to. Maybe.
I come from an art background, not a biological background, but I do have a deep love of native plants, and I'm turning my backyard into a wildflower garden. But in the early 2000s,
Let's see.
let's see, FaceTime video. You want to accept?
I don't know.
I can sympathize with this completely. So I was a graduate student in book arts, and it was at the time when the herbarium was going to be moved from the University of Iowa. I became friends with Diana Horton, and she so graciously allowed me to begin this project that I had thought up of making a little herbarium book. And the idea of it came from a book that I've carried with me for every time I've moved. I used to live in Western New York, and my elderly next door neighbor had this book and sold it to me. And it's native plants of New York, and it has these little ties, and you open it up, and this wonderful book has flaps and then all the different images inside of wildflowers of New York State. So loving this book and thinking about the loss of the herbarium, I decided that I wanted to do a project with Iowa wildflowers. And so I started, Diana and I she asked me which wildflowers I would like to include in this. And I made a bunch of suggestions, the pretty obvious ones, and then she would choose things that were less likely, things that I didn't know about. And together I photographed the specimens, and it becomes, you can't see this, it becomes this, a book. Here are the flaps, similar to the model that I was using. And there are 61 counties of Iowa that are part of this book. And let me see if I can hold this up. There's a little history of the herbarium, that helps. And it's called In the Field. And it has, here's the little history, and then it has, I began indexing the specimens that are in the book. And it starts, although the herbarium at the University of Iowa started in 1870, this starts in 1877 with the first specimen from Mary Linder. It was a wild tomato. And each of the, these are the index pages of the different plates. Each specimen has its Latin name, the person who collected the specimen, the county that it came from, and the date on the transparent page, and then underneath is a picture of the specimen itself. So for 61 counties, unfortunately, we didn't get to the 100 point of all of them, 100%, but 61 are represented, and it just runs the gamut, familiar to non-familiar. And Diana was such a wonderful person to work with. She was really kind and did everything she could to make this happen. But then it got forestalled. The specimens moved to Ames, and I was cluttering my life in other ways. And finally this summer, I decided, after I had cut all these plates were all hand cut, I decided that before I died, I wanted to finish this. So I started binding it this summer and came up with this this binding, which was pretty intricate and something I was putting off to do. So I came up, and there are 28 of them that I bound, and they're all just Iowa native flowers. They're done. They come in a cellophane wrapping, and I'm hoping that somebody might be interested in purchasing one. So that's it.
Oh, Mary Beth, that is beautiful. And what hard work. And oh my word, that's fantastic. Connie, would you be able to put in a chat, Mary, in the chat, just add either one of you add Mary Beth's contact information. So if people want to reach out to Mary Beth or to Connie, they would be able to connect with her via that. And we're not gonna post that on the Iowa Native Plant website or anything like that, because we'd have to do it for a lot of other people who are selling books. But this is just it's such a unique connection and value to our herbariums in Iowa but I think that people can reach out to you individually, and then that they would be able to get one of those. So thanks, Mary Beth. That's
And Mary
fantastic.
Beth, you're charging,
I'm
So-
charging, sorry, if we. do
Go
we
ahead.
have-
yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I'm charging $50 each.
Okay.
Uh,
Fantastic.
Cheap, but lots of work.
It's a lot of
Yeah,
work.
no, that's great. It's a work of art as well as a work of science. So I
So-
think with that, why don't we
Molly?
I'm gonna sort of put stuff on mute, and then you can, if you would just put Mary Beth's contact info.
I will do that.
Everybody
Molly,
can
can
do
you
that.
hear me? Molly,
can.
you?
Yeah.
Okay, just show me. No, the other
Oh,
books. So I just wanted to say, I've known Mary Beth for decades here in Iowa City. She and I have lived here. And we've known each other and enjoyed each other. So just to validate, I know, being an author, how important it is to validate one's work and the care that she takes. And she has these 5 books, 500 books that have been published on Iowa history right here. So she is not a newcomer to working
thank
to
you,
working
guys.
on books. And these are extremely beautiful, and they really reflect her love of the native plants. I think of them also as a kind of a tribute to the University of Iowa Herbarium and to Diana Horton's love for that herbarium, because they do involve Diana's work as well as Mary Beth. So I wanted to put in that plug. I'm going to do write a review, kind of a review of this book. It's not really a book, for our newsletter, but also I think Mary Beth may post something on the newsletter, but whatever we can do to spread the word about them, or to post them on other media, whatever, would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Native plants are not just for botanists, right? We want artists and writers to also be connected. So
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.